Hi and welcome to this video about CreateProcessAsUser versus CreateProcessWithTokenW. So here's the thing, the CreateProcess function allows us to create another process based on the same user as the caller. But what happens if you want to create a process running under a different user? And so Windows provides in the official API these two functions, CreateProcessAsUser and CreateProcessWithTokenW. The W here just means that there's only a Unicode version for that, there's no ASCII version. There's a Unicode and ASCII versions for CreateProcessAsUser. So I want to show you what are the differences between these two APIs. So let's go ahead and give it a shot. So I have this virtual machine. I'm going to do some experimentation. And so I've created here already a little project called CreateProcess that has these two functions, CreateProcessAsUserDemo and CreateProcessWithTokenDemo. And I'm going to call each one of them with some information like the name of the executable and some username and password. So I have some user called Alice on this machine, and that's Alice's password. I'm going to create a cmd.exe as a simple or one of the simplest things I could create. So let's start by looking at the CreateProcessAsUser. So I'm going to call CreateProcessAsUser. And if you're familiar with the CreateProcess function, which I've demonstrated a few times in previous videos, the parameters are almost identical. The only difference is that there's an additional parameter here, which is the first, indicating which token I'd like to use for creating the new process. And that token can represent a different user. And so if I specify null here, basically does the same thing as the normal CreateProcess API. But now I want to have some token here. So we'll get to how to get it next. But let's first fill in the details for CreateProcessAsUser, which is going to be very similar to CreateProcess. So I'm going to provide the executable name here as the one provided to me as a parameter. And then we have some security attributes for the new process and thread. I don't care about that. Then we have some handler inheritance, which I'm not going to use. There's some creation flags I'm not going to use. There's environment pointer, which I'm not going to use. I'm not going to use a lot here. Just take most of the defaults that you might be familiar with from the CreateProcess function. And so I'm going to have this call with these two structures. One of them is an input structure, startup info. I'm going to use the size of SI here to initialize the first member to the size of the structure. That's the bare minimum we need for the structure to be in a good state. And then process information is an output structure. And so there's no need to initialize that. We'll get some results if successful. In fact, if not as well. If this works, I'm going to just close the handles that I get just to be nice. So I have here the handle to the thread that we get here and the handle to the process. Let's just close them nicely. And then I'm going to return here the process ID at the end. So if everything works as okay, we're going to return the process ID that was just created. And if not, this is going to be 0, indicating a failure. So next we need to get a token here. And one way to get that is by using the logonUser API. So logonUser allows us to log in using information about the user as the user's username, domain, and password. Since we have all that, we're going to use it. So first we have the username. Then the domain is going to be my local machine. I'm not going to try to log into any domain controller or anything like that. So we're just talking about local users here. So this Alice user is supposed to be a local user. And then we have the plain text password provided to us. The next parameter is called the logon type, and you can look at the documentation for the various options. I'm going to use the option for interactive, basically indicating that we can use the interactive system to run this process, so it can use, at least in theory, the desktop and things like that, has a user profile, things of that kind. There are other kinds of logons you can have. Check out the documentation. Then there's something called a logon provider, and I'm going to just specify the default. There are two possible providers. For local machines, it's going to be NTLM, but I don't need to know that. I just can give the API a chance to figure it out on its own and do the best thing that is needed here. And then the last parameter is in fact the result. So I'm going to need to have a handle to the token here. That's the thing I would like to pass along to the CreateProcessAsUser function. And if this thing fails, there's really nothing I can do here. I'm just going to return 0 here as a way to indicate a failure. Okay, so now it's time to test it. Let's go ahead and press F5 to build this and run this until we get to that initial breakpoint. Let's start with logon user. And as you can see, this works. We get a handle to a token with value 11C. We can verify that indeed it points to Alice by looking at the CreateProcess here. We have the handle to token 11C, and you can see it points to Alice. And the number you can see besides Alice is something called the logon session ID. That's a way to identify the logon session from which tokens can be obtained for this Alice user, various processes that might be using Alice's credentials. And at this point there are none, but we may be able to create some as we're trying to do right now. If you want to see the entire set of logon sessions that you have, you need to use a different tool like my tool called System Explorer. You can also get a list from a command line tool called logon sessions from sysinternals. But if you go here to System and Logon Sessions, you'll find all the logon sessions that exist right now in the system, and one of them should be for Alice. So you can see here there's something here related to Alice. There's another Alice here, and that might be an Alice that is in fact logged into a different session. But regardless, you can see the numbers here are different, or different session. Right now, the current session is perhaps not easy to see, but it's supposed to be session 4, I think. Let's see. So actually session 5, so it's session 5, but there's session 4 already on this system. So if I compare this logon session ID, we should see the same number as shown with Process Explorer when looking at the token handle. So that's 3E9DE and so on. And indeed, this is the one right here, 3E9, in session number 5, in the console session number 5. It's just a way to see the entire set of logon sessions that you have on a machine. You can see here the authentication package is NTLM, and the logon type is interactive, is exactly what I was asking for. And this is the seed representing Alice in this particular case. Okay, so this first step succeeded, which is good. We can move on to the next step and try to call CreateProcessAsUser. And you can see that it fails. We didn't get a proper handle, and there's no new process being created. If we try to figure out what went wrong, we can look at the ERR, which is the get last error thing, and with the comma HR, it provides the textual description. It says privilege not held. And the thing is that we're missing a privilege. And the privilege required here is called the assigned primary. And fortunately, it's not provided to users by default. Even administrators don't get this privilege by default. And by default, who gets that? We can check this out by looking at the local security policy, see what's going on here on my local machine. So we can go to local policies and user rights assignment. This shows the entire set of supported privileges and which users or groups have them. In this particular case, we're talking about this thing called replace process level token. That's the descriptive name for the assigned primary token privilege. If I double click, we can see clearly that only the service accounts, local service, network service have them by default. So in order for this API, CreateProcessUser, to have any chance of working, I would need to run this from one of these users. So I could perhaps try to run it using some kind of different process, maybe ask some service like using PSExec, one of the sysinternals tools that knows how to run something under the system account that can have this privilege. Or we can use a task scheduler and create a task that knows how to run this particular executable using a different user like local service. But instead, I'm going to try to add myself here, which is that's my username here on this machine. I want to have that privilege myself. So I'm going to add my user and click OK. Now, the way this works is that you don't get that privilege immediately. You can't. The privileges cannot be added or removed from tokens, from existing tokens. The only thing you can do is to log off and log on again. And once you log on, you're going to get the new privilege that was assigned to you by an administrator, of course. Only an administrator can add or remove privileges in the user database. So I'm going to pause the video while I log off and log on again into the system. Okay, so I've logged into my machine again. I've logged off and logged on. I didn't really restart the system, just logged off and logged on my user. So now I'm going to run this again, and now I should see something different. Well, at least we can hope, right? So let's start with logon user. This works as before. There was no issue there previously either. And now we can go, just before we do the actual deed for CreateProcessUser, just let's verify. If I go to my process right now, you notice that I have the assigned primary token privilege, which is the one that I need. Although it is disabled, we can definitely enable that, but in fact we don't actually have to, and that's because the API is nice enough to enable the privilege if it exists and then disable it after it's done. So let's see if it works. Let's go and do CreateProcessAsUser. You can see it succeeds, and I get a console window here. This is my CMD that I just created. We can go here to Process Explorer here to see that CMD is running under the user Alice, rather than some other user like myself. So we're running under Alice here. So that seems to have worked. And we can continue with the application. In this case, we just have the process ID. We return that and it's all good. We have the CMD running. Does that really mean that it's running very well? Well, not necessarily. So first we can see here that there's the same console is being used by these two processes. We get some like messages there which are a bit confusing, but we could have created a new console. But let's see if we can write something, we can run something from this console, like who am I or something like this. And you can see we get this nasty error that seems to indicate that something is wrong. And if I try to run something else like Notepad, again, seems to be wrong. And this particular error, which has the value C all zeros 142, this is an anti-status value that indicates that one of the DLLs in the new process, this Notepad instance, failed to initialize. That is, a DLL main function there returned 0. So something definitely is off. From the kernel's perspective, this worked just fine. The kernel returned true here from CreateProcessUser, which means that from the kernel's perspective, the process was created successfully. But once it started to execute code in its user mode application space, in its code, something went wrong. Anti-DLL wasn't happy, the loader, and caused the process eventually to crash. So obviously it's not ideal, and we're missing a few things. In fact, we are missing a few crucial pieces, but I'm not going to cover them in this video. Let's just assume that we have some kind of success, which is the best we can get right now without adding a considerable amount of code. So for now, we'll leave that as kind of a success. Okay, or at least partial success. Let's go ahead and use CreateProcessWithToken demo here. So the function in question is called CreateProcessWithTokenW. That's one thing we can call. And again, it requires us to have a token that's already available to us. We can use the same CreateProcessAsUser idea here by calling logon user first, and so we can get that token and then move forward. That certainly is one way to go about it, but there's a simpler way with CreateProcessWithTokenW. With TokenW, you can use something called with logonW. What that does, it combines logon user and CreateProcessWithTokenW. Just does both these things together. It just simplifies the code a little bit. We just need to make a single call rather than to have multiple calls. So we have the username here. Let's grab it. We have the domain. It's always going to be my local machine here. We have the passwords. That's the parameters, the first parameters to logon user. Then we also need to specify the other stuff here. And so we have some logon flags, which we don't need at this point, but we could force the flags here to indicate that we would like to load the user's profile. Perhaps we could do that as well. That is, load the HKey current user hive into the registry for the new process to be able to use it if the profile is not loaded already. And so that's something that could be useful, but could be slightly slower. And then we need to specify exactly what we'd like to load. That's going to be this executable. We have the creation flags, and all the rest of the parameters are basically the same. So we have a null environment here, and null current directory, and startup info and process information. So obviously I can just copy this stuff from here. Here goes. We're preparing these structures, and then we're going to do the same thing as before. We're going to look at the return value. If that's true, we're going to close the handles, and regardless, we're going to return the process ID like so. So that's supposed to be good enough. Let's go ahead and make sure. Okay, so now we can call the other function, CreateProcess with token demo, and see what that looks like. Let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here and see if this works. Okay, let's press F10 and it works. And here's our CMD popping up in a way that perhaps seems to be a bit nicer than previously. Let's see. Can I do who am I? Yep, I'm Alice, not a problem. Can I launch something like Notepad? Yes, I can launch a Notepad, and it works in the expected way. If I look at the processes here, let's go ahead and take a look at CMD. Here's CMD running under Alice. Also, if I look up Notepad, Notepad also is running under Alice. So you can see there's Alice Notepad here. There's another one here that is unrelated. It was there previously, or it's running in the Alice other session. But notice that we have session number 7 here. And in fact, all my other processes here, like Explorer and all these, should be running under the same session 7. So we're in session 7 now. We were in 5, now I logged off and logged on, and we're in session 7. So this seems to work, and in fact work even better than CreateProcessAsUser. That's interesting, because if it's so good, why would I want to use CreateProcessAsUser to begin with? Is there any downside to CreateProcess with token? Is there any downside to calling this function instead of calling CreateProcessUser, which we know there has some significant downsides? We need that particular privilege, which normally is not provided to any user, any normal user. And also we have some more stuff to do here to actually make things work appropriately, which is definitely non-trivial. So obviously something is amiss. And the thing is that CreateProcessWithToken, or with logon, which is just a shortcut for calling that, has an additional requirement which is not clearly visible. And the way this function actually works is by communicating with a service. So if I go to services here, just open the list of services on my machine. Let's see if I can write this appropriately. There's a service called secondary logon. That's the one, seclogon, that's the official short name. And this is the one that actually allows me to do what I was trying to do. And so if this service is somehow stopped or disabled, then this is not going to work out. So let's go ahead and give it a try. So I'm going to go to Task Manager here. I can also go Process Explorer, but Task Manager is going to be slightly easier to find. So I have this seclogon here. I want to kill this process. As you can see in the services, I don't have enough permissions to actually stop the service. I can pause it, but I can't stop it. So let's go ahead and kill it forcefully. So I have this ability to go to the process, the particular SVC host hosting this service. Let's just end this process. So if I refresh here, this should go away. It's no longer running, but if I try this again by running the code, it's going to start the service automatically. Let's see if that in fact is the case. Let's go ahead and press F5 again and try to call this. And you can see it works. And you can see if we go back to the list of services and press F5 to refresh, it is running again. So apparently the API is smart enough to start the service if it has been stopped for whatever reason. So we have to do better than that. So let's go ahead and try this again. Let's find the service seclogon, go to the process it's being hosted in, and let's kill it again, just like before. But this time I'm going to go to services. I'm going to change the properties here to make the service completely disabled. When it's disabled, it's not going to be started by the API, because start service is not going to work out, and it's not going to take the service out of its particular state. And so if I go ahead and try that now, let's see what happens. I press F10 and it fails. It fails, and you can see the error here saying error service disabled, basically saying the seclogon service is disabled, so I'm not able to create this new process. So there you have it. We have these two options, but each one has an upside and a downside. If the seclogon service is disabled somehow by some administrator, then CreateProcessWithTokenW is not going to work out. CreateProcessAsUser is directly going to the kernel, so it has no dependencies on any kind of service, but to actually use it successfully, the first thing you at least need is the assigned primary token privilege, and even that is not strictly enough to actually get a proper behavior, but that's something you can definitely do. There's some code you can write to make it properly work, but at least you still have to have that privilege. Without this privilege, you can't call CreateProcessAsUser regardless of any other code that you have. So we have two options. One is definitely simpler, but has this hidden dependency on the service, and then we have the first option here, which is more powerful, but requires more power. That requires a particular privilege, normally not given to anyone except the service account, which means that services typically use CreateProcessAsUser. That's something that you can do very easily. PSExec, for instance, a well-known tool from sysinternals, does that, and so any service technically can call this function without issues. However, normal users normally can't do that unless they are granted that privilege.